Hello, everybody. Welcome to the 23rd episode of the Manor Podcast. I'm your co-host, Roger Bodee, joined as always with my best friend and other co-host, Michael Hamilton. Michael, if you were to use the website 23andMe to find your heritage, what would your heritage be?
I'm not familiar with this website, 23andMe.
Yeah, they're a service that you can use, and they'll analyze your DNA and tell you all about your ancestry and where you came from. You never heard of this website before?
No, I have not. Did we get sponsored?
No, we're not sponsored.
Oh.
We're not cool enough for that yet.
Unlucky. So what would I find if I use this website to analyze my heritage?
Yeah, do you know what your heritage is? Do you know where you came from?
I do not. What about you? What would we find if you used the website to analyze your heritage?
I probably should use this website because my father was adopted, so he never knew who his biological parents were, and my mother never knew who her dad was. So I just have a big old mystery lottery when it comes to who I'm actually related to in life.
So how would the website know that? Is it like a DNA test or something?
Yeah, it would then match your chromosomes and your good pairs of DNA to other like pairs of matched DNA and tell you where you came from.
This sounds like a way to spend a lot of money on something I don't care about.
It's not that much money. It's only like $100 or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
Do you know what the 4 letters are for the makeup of your DNA?
Nope.
It's ATCG. It's adenine, thymine, guanine, and cytosine.
Cool. I will not remember that.
I learned this because in 8th grade, it was a required assignment to write all about your ancestry for this class paper. And I told my teacher, I don't know my heritage, and my father was adopted and my mom never knew who her dad was. I can't write this paper. I don't know what to tell you. And my teacher was like, okay, you just have to write a very in-depth science paper about genetics and DNA. And I don't know why those 4 letters and names of those chemical compounds have stuck with me ever since. So
cool.
Yeah. So today's episode is not about genetics, though, although
it's not.
You're clearly genetically predisposed to being amazing at card games. So I don't know how insightful you'll be, but we're going to be talking about how to get better at card games.
Yeah. So I don't know if genetics apply to card games, if that's a thing. Just like,
oh, they do. They 100% do. You got the whole nature versus nurture thing.
Oh, sure.
But that's more of a psychology belief.
Yeah.
Or study, I should say.
Okay. That makes sense. So I guess in general, our podcast is always aimed at helping people get better. But outside of listening to our podcast, I don't know if we've ever really gone through and talked about what you can actually do yourself to get better at the game. And thought it would be good to actually just kind of break down the different things you can do if you're looking to improve at Flesh and Blood.
Yeah, so
outside of listening to us, of course.
So what do you do every day to get better at Flesh and Blood, Michael? Do you meditate with cardboard in your hand under waterfalls, or?
No. So the first thing I do almost every day, not every day, is I playtest. And we kind of touched on playtesting a little bit in the deck building episode a few weeks ago, but it was very light and I wanted to go a little bit deeper on what actually is involved in effectively playtesting. So the first thing when you're playtesting, you should be asking questions and trying to find answers to those questions.
What kind of questions should you be asking?
So maybe you should have a sideboard plan and you should be testing to see if the cards you're sideboarding in this matchup are doing what you're trying to do, and if your deck is still functioning the way you intend it to be after sideboarding. So a good example of this was back in the Prism meta. When you were playing Rune Blades or Fi even, a lot of people would bring in a reasonable amount of poppers for the Prism matchup. And generally, Prism would plan to fight against these aggressive decks with auras because auras were the most powerful thing Prism could do. So she'd be putting down these auras and not really attacking with heralds that often. And sometimes when they did, your attacks would have -1, so the Command and Conquer and Erase Faces wouldn't even pop the heralds anyway. So you should be really analyzing how effective these poppers are in the matchup. And if they are causing issues as much as they're helping you. Because if Prism plays a turn where she just plays 2 auras and your hand has 1 or even worse 2 of these poppers, and your turn ends up being quite clunky because you have these poppers instead of some more efficient or smooth actions like go again attacks or something in your deck, and you have these poppers instead, that could be a pain point as well. And these cards that you're siding in to try to help you with the matchup are actually making it worse sometimes. So part of playtesting is asking questions about your sideboard configurations and trying to figure out if the games are playing out the way you expect them to be when you're making sideboard decisions.
What about asking questions like, why would I ever bother playing this deck when I know Tarek Patel's going to be in the tournament and that's going to make it so I have buys? Are those good questions to ask?
What? I don't understand. That's.
Or conversely, why should I bother testing when I know Michael Hamilton's going to be at the tournament? I can't possibly win. Are those good questions to ask?
Questions about Flesh and Blood. Questions about cards or decisions you're making in the game or outside of the game that relate to the game.
Do you know what I'm actually getting at with those questions, though?
No, please explain to me.
They're pretty meta questions. So you can ask questions about what you expect the tournament to be like. So I guess that's a pretty common term that people use, which is a meta game. Do you want to explain like what a meta, when people talk about that, what that actually means?
Okay, yeah. So the meta of a field is kind of the expected decks that you'll play against. So, or I guess it is the decks you'll play against, and you're trying to basically predict the meta of a tournament you're going to. For example, if you are thinking about playing Oldheim at the Pro Tour in Lille, and you think the metagame is going to be almost all aggro decks with very little Prism, then Oldheim is a great choice, and you should probably play Oldheim. But if the metagame is going to be 30% Prism, then suddenly Oldheim looks a lot worse because you're basically pretty close to guaranteed to lose each of those matches that you get paired against Prism. So predicting the metagame can be a very powerful tool for deck choice for events.
Gotcha. That makes sense.
The next thing for effective playtesting is to have goals going into your sessions. So if you are trying to figure out the best way to sideboard a matchup, that is a good goal to have. And it kind of goes, this kind of goes hand in hand with asking questions. Like your goal may be to find the answers to these questions, like how to sideboard, or can I build this deck in a way to be favored against this other matchup that I expect to be a common part or a common piece in the metagame. And you can spend time playtesting to try to figure that out. And if not, maybe that means if you can't solve those things or you don't meet your goals, maybe it's time to look at a different deck or a different hero, or maybe it's time to just do something else, basically, I guess.
What if my goal is to be the best Flesh and Blood player in the world? Is that a good goal to have when I'm going into playtesting? So
your goals for playtesting should be more specific than that, and basically,
okay, I want to be the best Flesh and Blood player in Indiana. That's a smaller region, right? That's a more realistic playtesting goal.
That's it should be something that you should be able to feel like you've accomplished during the session. And it's hard to really measure who the best player in an area is during a playtest session. And it's not.
Well, it's easy when we playtest, since I'm playtesting into you, so.
But that doesn't. You're making this a hard episode.
That's my goal.
That was your goal. Well, at least you have a goal, you know?
Yeah. I got to appreciate the small wins where you can take them.
Mm-hmm. So in general, your goal should be aimed at something specific to a matchup or a hero or something that will help you do better in the tournament. So if your goal is to be the best Flesh and Blood player, that isn't something that you can realistically accomplish in a playtest session, and it's not something that's very measurable either, which is important as well.
Here's a good example of a goal that I had in a playtesting session where I just wanted to get one game off of you when we were playtesting Prism versus Viserai, and you were just beating me up game after game after game after game. And I just wanted one teeny tiny win with Prism against Viserai in order to make myself feel better. And I got it. That was a good goal.
Yeah.
Okay, so what else about playtesting? So is there anything else about playtesting before we move on, or no?
So the last thing I want to talk about with playtesting is it can be very helpful to get different perspectives. And I think one way that you could do that is just playing both sides of a matchup. So if you're trying to figure out the Prism versus Viserai matchup, you should try playing both as Prism and as Viserai, because if you are the Prism, if you're trying to learn the Prism side of the matchup, playing as Viserai can be very useful, because when you are playing against the opposing Prism and they do things that are very efficient or cause problems for you, that can kind of shape how you want to play the game for the Prism side. You can kind of take away things from that as well. And you also can kind of see what their awkward points are, or the pain points of the Viserai deck, and kind of potentially learn ways to exploit those. So if you're playing Viserai and you're like, wow, this hand's really, really bad, and your opponent is playing Prism and they attack you with one blue aura without going in because they used their whole hand to block last turn. They just attack with one blue aura for 1 damage, and suddenly you can use your Crown of Providence and it fixes your whole hand. You might not realize that that's something that would be happening from just playing the Prism side of the matchup. If you play as Viserai and have that experience where it fixes the hand, then that could be a good takeaway that you get from playing both sides of the matchup.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. And I see here you say play multiple decks, so that means you want to play every deck that you're thinking about playing in a tournament into every deck that could exist, to make sure you know how your Levia and Azalea and Bolton matchups are handling.
Yep, you just need to spend infinite hours. Otherwise, why are you bothering? No.
Okay.
I think you should play decks that you expect to show up as a reasonable percentage of the metagame. Like we were talking about, it's kind of important to at least take a guess at what you think will show up. And people will bring random decks out of left field that you can't really expect. But for the most part, Flesh and Blood tournaments are reasonably predictable in what you would think would show up. Like if Oldheim and Icelander have been doing well, Oldheim, Icelander, and Fi, then you can reasonably predict in the future metagame there will be a significant amount of Oldheim, Icelander, and Fi. And it might be 2 of those heroes are more popular and one's a little less popular, but you can get a good idea of what you should be spending some time learning and playing against just by what's been doing well recently.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. It feels like a lot of these playtesting things are also requiring you to do a good amount of homework outside of your playtesting sessions, but that's not necessarily a bad thing either.
Yeah, that's true. I didn't even think about that because I just do that stuff a lot of the time.
It's okay. It's okay. We're just hashing it out.
Yeah.
We're just trying to have a meaningful discussion over here. So I guess next on your notes here is saying have meaningful discussions about Flesh and Blood. So what is the distinction between a meaningful and a meaningless conversation about Flesh and Blood?
I like your transition.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
But I guess a meaningless, I don't want to say meaningless, but I don't like that terminology. But meaningful discussions are conversations where the goal is to learn something and learn for you and the person you're talking with. Hopefully one of you learn something and ideally both of you learn something from it. And the first step to having a meaningful discussion is finding other players that have similar goals to you. That doesn't have to be the same, but if you are pretty competitive focused and are trying to do well at tournaments, then you want to find other players that have similar goals where they're trying to prepare and do well at tournaments. And this kind of goes back to what we were talking about with the team, with the Wolfpack. And I think like finding this group has been great because there's just a lot of great players here that have similar goals. They're all trying to prepare and do well in tournaments. So it makes it much easier to have people to talk to. But if you're not part of a Flesh and Blood team, which most of the community is not, then outside of just like talking to your friends and stuff, one thing that I found that you can do a lot is after a match, especially if it was a loss and you and your opponent had good vibes during the game, which is most of the time when you're playing Flesh and Blood because the community is great here, you can ask your opponents questions and kind of try to get their opinion on maybe specific plays that stood out to you and ask them like how things felt, or if there's just, you could be more general, just be like, was there anything that I did that seemed wrong to you? Or you can ask about specific plays and they can be like, yeah, when you took 9 damage to Oakenold me back and Oakenold me instead of just blocking out, I felt very good because I just got to husk it and move on instead of getting fatigued. And that was a conversation I had with Ryan Rich after our match in a pro quest where I was playing Oldheim into his chain. And I had taken a reasonable amount of damage to play an Oaken Old fused, and he just hussed it. And I was like, that was probably bad. And I asked him after the game, and he's like, yeah, when you did that, I thought I had a pretty good chance of winning. So that's just a great way to kind of open the discussion, is ask about a play you made that you think may have been not correct or bad, and hopefully your opponent's pretty receptive to it. And that's a great way to find people that'll kind of have discussions with.
Yeah, there's something that's baked into this point, though, that I think you alluded to briefly in the you said there's a lot of great players on our team, and we all know Ryan Rich is somebody who's very good at Flesh and Blood, despite his performance in our team sealed that one time. But you know, I had to be the dead weight because you won the last team sealed without me, so you're welcome for me wanting to go home afterwards. But anyways, so not only is it important to ask questions, right? But it's important to be asking the questions to good players, right? Or players of similar skill level to you.
Yeah, I think ideally you always want to be asking questions to someone who's a little bit better than you at the game, but that's not always a possibility just because of who's available.
Okay, but imagine you're just starting out and you and everybody around you just learned how to play Flesh and Blood last week, or when we first started. Like, what kind of questions, or what kind of, are you saying we didn't have any meaningful discussions until after you won Orlando and you were deemed a good player?
No, we had lots of good discussions before that. And we did kind of talk about a lot of the plays that we made in games and ask if this was working. I did say good player, but I don't think that's like necessarily true. It just needs to be someone that's like thinking about the game. And I think we were like thinking about the game very well, reasonably, before we went to any tournaments.
Yeah, I think you think we were thinking about the game, but I think that you think that we weren't necessarily thinking about the game the way that we needed to think about the game, you know?
Sorry, can you repeat that? I got lost a little bit.
Okay, moving on.
Oh, okay.
So, spending time discussing matchups and strategies. So, it sounds like you need to start having meaningful discussions during playtesting. So you're kind of going hand in hand. So you need to meaningfully discuss the matchup while you're conducting effective playtesting. We're looping it all together, Michael.
Yeah, it all kind of goes together. But in general, when you're playtesting and you have these goals and you're asking questions, instead of just asking yourself these questions, you can also ask your opponent these questions and see what their thoughts are on the matters. And when you're trying different sideboard things, you can share that with your opponent. You can be like, hey, I'm trying out blue brain freeze, and I really want to know if it's good when I cast it and how you feel like it impacts you. And you tell your opponent that, your opponent knows that, you go into the game and you blue brain freeze them and look at their hand and put something on top that maybe it's not that impactful, or it doesn't feel that impactful to you, but then your opponent's like, yeah, because you brain freeze me, I couldn't play around X thing, or I just didn't have a very good turn because you took the card I needed to play, or something like that. And just like asking questions about the things you're attempting and kind of discussing what you think might be good. And you can also be like, when you're asking them about it, they can be like, yeah, it was actually good in that spot, but I really only have 6 targets for blue brain freeze. So most of the time you're just going to miss when you play it. So it's probably was kind of fortunate that it was good and not like the average case. And that's something you might not see if you only have time to play 1 or 2 games and you cast it once or twice and it's good both times. And it can be good to get that outside opinion on the matter, outside perspective. There we go.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Okay. So I'm liking the 2 things we have so far. And what I know that you do as well all the time is because 50% of the games you play are feature matches. And, most of those are, matches where you win. You watch those over and over and over again just because you love seeing yourself win so much. So could you talk about how you do replay analysis in all the games you win?
I wouldn't say I watched them over and over and over again. But
every time I walk into your house, right on a big screen TV is you beating Pheno Black over and over again. You're like, oh, here it comes, Roger. I'm about to draw the rainbow Oaken Old. And then... and I'm like, I know, Michael, I was there.
So outside of feature matches, there's a pretty easy way to get your replays recorded. And when you're playing on either Talishar or Tabletop Simulator, you can just use any screen recording program and just record your games and go back and watch them. I've found that's pretty helpful, and it makes it like Yeah, playing a bunch of feature matches does make it easy to have games to analyze, but it is still very easy to just record on your computer. I recommend OBS. That's what I've been using, or OBS Studio, I think it's called.
Mm-hmm.
But that's what I use. There are lots of good programs out there that you can use to just record and go back and watch your games. If you're playing in paper with physical cards, it's reasonably harder to do, but you could set up a camera and record.
Yeah, just break out your dad's VHS tape recorder from back in the day, put it right next to your monitor and go to town. And then when you're watching it, and what kind of things should people be looking for during this replay analysis? Should they just be looking for the turn cycles that they won, or is it more involved than that?
So looking at the turn cycles you won can be useful. You can see if there's something that you did to really put your opponent in a bad spot. But the main thing that you're looking for, or the main thing I'm looking for when I watch replays, is basically points that I made mistakes or points where I had a sideboard card that was ineffective. So
yeah, how do you identify a mistake, though?
So when you're playing Flesh and Blood in person or online or anywhere, you only have so much time to make every decision. You can't necessarily run through every single possibility and figure out every possible thing that could have happened with those set of cards that you have in the set and the blocks you need to make on your opponents and all that. During replay review, you can pause and think for 5 minutes, 10 minutes, as long as you need to try to figure out what the optimal line is. And like I said before, Flesh and Blood's mostly about math, and usually the optimal line is just whatever gives you the most damage output. And there's some things that can change that, like if you should use a key piece of equipment, if it's the time to use it, or you could save your equipment and do something else. And there are other things other than just like the raw value of your 4 cards. And whether you should use your equipment here depends on like if this is a better spot than you're likely to get in the rest of the game, depending on the equipment piece and that kind of thing. But
yeah, we're getting pretty heady here. So there's a couple things that I'm worried about with replay analysis. One is, since games of Flesh and Blood are so dynamic, what could appear to be a right or wrong decision, if we looked at the numbers or did the math or really thought about it, it could be the wrong decision, but it worked out anyways. And that kind of falls into the trap of like, well, it worked here, so it was clearly the right decision. So you can start getting like results-oriented thinking, potentially, if you're not careful with this kind of review. And then 2, since the games are so dynamic, it's pretty easy to also just look at it and be like, well, yeah, I made the right play on this turn cycle, but because my opponent is going to draw a Rainbow Oakenhold perfect hand on the next turn cycle, I lost the game, and there wasn't much I could do about it other than blocking ineffectively earlier. But then that only works if my opponent draws a perfect Rainbow Oakenhold, but if they don't, then all my prior turn cycles were good. Does that make any sense?
That is a very good point. How do you not be results oriented? How do you analyze like what is the correct play and what is the play that would have won the game, even if it was the correct or the incorrect play in the long run?
Right.
I guess, do you have a current method that you use to determine what was incorrect versus like sometimes like you said, the game-winning play is the incorrect play in the long term? How do you approach looking at that?
So when I'm trying to think about decisions I made in the game afterwards, whether it be just, this meaningful discussion or in a replay review, although I don't really do replay reviews personally. I think that they're good, but they're time consuming. We'll say that much. This is going to be one of the more time consuming ways you can improve.
It's also a little bit less fun than just playtesting more.
Right. But yeah, so you have to think about it in terms of like, well, what do you actually know at that point in time, or what could you reasonably know? And it's going to be paying attention to what your opponent pitched. So if your opponent's already pitched or used 2 Oakenholds, then you say, well, I could have known that there was this one more Oakenhold coming up at the end of first cycle. And based on these earlier turn cycles, I could have played around it better. Or you also get the inverse of what cards haven't your opponent pitched or played yet. So if you're almost halfway through the first cycle and your opponent hasn't played a channel like Frigid, you might want to play a bit more aggressively in the next few turns, knowing that it's going to be harder for you to effectively use your cards if there's a channel like Frigid out. So if you're watching and you're like, oh, wait a second, I'm like 40 cards into this, we're 40 cards into our decks right now. And I totally could have seen that there's this channel like Frigid coming up in the next 20 cards. I could have adjusted my strategy here. So I think that's what makes this analysis hard, is you really have to pay attention to not only the cards of what you are playing and aren't playing, but also what your opponent's cards are pitching and playing. And that's just kind of what makes Flesh and Blood so complex.
Yeah, that's a great point. And a replay analysis is kind of like a replay review is kind of a low stakes way of trying to start paying attention to that kind of thing. Like maybe you're watching a replay and you make a play that gets blown out by Sink Below, and then you look back at the video and you're like, wow, they didn't have it's like the 5th or 6th turn and they hadn't played a Sink Below yet, so it's kind of likely that they would have it there. That's maybe Blizzard's a better example as a card that would blow you out. Sink Below just does an efficient thing, but
unless you're Dorinthia.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. Maybe you took damage to play a dominate effect and they had Sink Below in their arsenal, so it wasn't ended up being kind of bad. Something like that, maybe.
Mm. Yeah, but I think that's paying attention to cards played and pitch stacking is really what separates people who play at the highest levels of the game and I think the average player, just because there's so much to consider on like each individual turn cycle of the game. It's very hard to then also have this other tracking system in your head of notable cards on both your end and your opponent's end and when they were played. It just is very mentally taxing. So I guess that could be a good point to replay review, is just trying to keep track of different points and times of like pitch stacks or card scene is something that's like, and just try to think like, oh, okay, well, I saw on turn 1 they pitched this card. They should be drawing it here in the next 2 turns, right? And then they'll draw in the next 2 turns and you go like, yeah, hell yeah, I saw that coming. And then you'll feel better about yourself and it'll help you then go and do that in like a real tournament setting as well.
Yeah. When I added replay review to the show notes, I didn't even think about it as like how much it's helped me like practice not counting cards, but like keeping track of pitch stacks and stuff. It's a great way to just kind of pay attention to that kind of stuff. And the more you practice it, the more you'll be able to do it in live games and the less like brain space it'll take up. I don't know if that's the right way to phrase that, but like the more natural it'll start becoming to just like track a few things or start tracking the key cards.
Right. And then you kind of get into these cool meta in-game meta decisions where, for example, I had a really cool matchup against Oldtime over the weekend, and I saw him pitch a blue Earthlore Surge right next to a red Pummel and a red CNC. And 5 or 6 turns later, when we were getting close to our 3rd cycle, I was going for the Kills Icelander, and he pitched a blue Earthlore Surge. And I was like, oh, I know he's either going to have 1 to 2 reds in his hand now on top of which, so he's not going to be able to pay for any further arcane damage. I can just safely go for a kill here. And it worked out. I, played my next Aether Icebane, triggered my Insidious Chill, and lo and behold, he discarded a red Pummel. And I was like, cool. I kept track of this. It paid off. And I get to make more competent decisions in the game because it's something I paid attention to.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great example of that being very rewarding.
Okay, anything else you want to talk about replay reviews, though?
So the last thing, I'm bringing it up again. Replays are a great thing to discuss with others if you have people that you can talk about the game with, pointing to spots in the replay that you're like, hey, I think this was a mistake, or hey, how could I have sequenced this better? Reaching out to someone. They don't need to be better than you. They can be on the same level, or they don't, like just someone that will like spend some time to think about it and talk about it with you. And they can bring up potential other lines that you didn't consider, or even just kind of like help you confirm the math that this was the correct play or the incorrect play and why. It's just another great thing to talk about others with.
Okay, so you want to record your effective play testing to have meaningful discussions during a replay review. Got it.
Yes.
And then you post it on YouTube for others to consume content for.
Yeah, so...
Spoilers, last point.
Yeah, so our last point is something that you're already doing if you're listening to this podcast, but it's just consuming content. There's tons of great Flesh and Blood content out there. There's tons of content that's not directly related to Flesh and Blood as well, that it also applies to Flesh and Blood if you just like look for ways to get better at things. And there's just tons of material online about that kind of stuff. And the main thing that I want to stress is when you listen to a podcast or you read an article about something related to the game, really try to like take something from it and apply it to your next session, or apply it as soon as possible. So otherwise it can be very easy to just kind of like let the information go through your head and kind of fall back out if you aren't actively using it or trying to apply things you learned. An example would be, after listening to our deck building episode, it would be very helpful to go and attempt to build decks using some of the lessons that we talked about in that episode. And furthermore, you can even go further and try to play test with it and tune it using lessons as well. And that would be a great way to help have what we kind of talked about sink in, if that makes sense.
Okay, so when I'm listening to the Instant Speed podcast, since I'm an Instant Speed patron, how am I getting better by listening to Flake talking about his latest casting session?
Okay, I guess I should say content that is aimed at improvement there.
So you're saying I'm getting worse by listening to Flake?
No,
I'm actively getting worse as a Flesh and Blood player?
I love the Instant Speed podcast. Flake has a great show. It's not super aimed at helping you improve at Flesh and Blood all the time. Some of the episodes are. Like some of the episodes, he talks about some strategy stuff with guests. But a lot of the time, it's like Flesh and Blood news and what's going on in the world of Wraith, I guess. And
well, that's a different podcast.
And
your other favorite podcast. I'm not even going to say their name because you're on that podcast so often. People already know.
And it's not going to hurt you to listen to things that aren't super competitive focused. And it's good to enjoy your hobbies however you enjoy them. And that's fine. But if you are listening to something with the intent of getting better at the game, then it really helps what you listen to or reading. This applies to articles as well. Listening to or reading, and really try to apply things from it. And that helps it stick with you and helps you kind of like see what you were hearing in like a different perspective, or get your own perspective on it. And that makes it stick better.
So what articles are there published regularly that you read then? Or what website should people go to?
So I guess I will shout out the Wraith Times. That's a great one that I've written a few articles for them, and I read a lot of what is posted there. There's a few other websites that aren't coming to mind right now, but give me a second. I'm just going to look real quick.
I know Channel Fireball has them, but they have an author on there. I won't name names. They have an author on Channel Fireball who's so bad at writing. He inspired me to actually start writing articles that are actually of good quality. And that's how I wrote my very first article for the Wraith Times. Is I read one of his articles and I was like, this is a flaming dumpster fire. I can't believe this is actually being published about Flesh and Blood. I need to put out some good content in order to counterbalance how horrendous this article was. He posted like a Dorinthia deck that was for like sabers or whatever, and he had like the Dominate for Axes card in it. I can't think of its name at the moment.
Spill but like blood.
He had Spill Blood in like his Sabers Dorinthia deck, and I'm like, what is happening here?
That sounds like just an oversight if that's what happened. But anyway, so I have a few more websites outside of Channel Fireball. So the main Fab TCG occasionally has Flesh and Blood articles that are aimed at strategy. A lot of the time it's, again, just news and updates about what's going on, but there is some strategy stuff that gets posted on there. And then there's a site called Red Riot Games that also has some Flesh and Blood articles on there as well. So I'm sure there's others that I don't know. Feel free to leave comments with names of websites with good Flesh and Blood articles, because I'd also love to have access to more resources. But those are the ones that I look at.
Okay. I don't really read very many articles these days.
Yeah, you just need infinite time for Flesh and Blood like me, and then you can read all the articles, listen to all the podcasts.
Yeah, I have a very limited amount of time to dedicate to Flesh and Blood, and it does not include 2 of these 4 things we're talking about.
You just need more time. Then you can do a bunch of effective playtesting, have a bunch of meaningful discussions. Review a lot of replays.
Angela, I can't help with Austin tonight. I gotta go do some replay reviews.
Yeah. Priorities. There's Flesh and Blood, and then there's your baby.
Yeah, Austin will be here for the next 18 years. He ain't going anywhere. I need to consume this content now.
Well, it's relevant. So I guess those are the 4 main things that I do to help me improve at Flesh and Blood. And you said you do 2 of them regularly, and you consume some content, just not as many articles, right?
Yeah, and the content that I do consume is like the Instant Speed podcast, or most of the time I would consider the podcast that shall not be named to be just an entertainment podcast, because
wow,
I don't feel like every episode they do is like necessarily geared towards necessarily getting better. It's just kind of like fluff content sometimes, but that's not so bad.
Some of our episodes aren't exactly aimed at getting better. Like we talked about why we love card games, and that was a great episode, and I love doing it. But I wouldn't say it helps people get better at the game.
Oh yeah. It's just a question of like how often do you post fluff, you know? And I feel like our fluffometer is getting pretty high, but
ours is.
Maybe. I don't know. I guess it depends on like what you consider fluff and whatnot. Like, is this conversation about fluff now diluting our quality podcast by adding fluff to it now?
Maybe. We'll leave it in though. All right. Anything else you want to add before we wrap it up?
Yeah, I do. So can we rate these in terms of like what is most important then to what is least important for busy guys like me, so we know how to best use our time then?
Yeah, sure. Well,
so which of these is the most important you would consider to being a better Flesh and Blood player?
I would say that effective playtesting, the first few hours you put into Flesh and Blood should probably go into playtesting. If you're playing less than 1 or 2 games a week, then it's going to be pretty tough to really be able to get much from anything else, I think, if you're not at least playing a little bit of the game. But
that's way lower than I would say. I would say like you should be playing like 10 games a week, 5 to 10 games a week, like 1 game a day between like Talishar or something like that. And like you have to think most people will probably play like 3 matches, 3 to however many, like 3 to 4 to 5 during their local armory events. So I think it's not that difficult to say, you know, at least try to on average get like 1 game of Flesh and Blood a day. And that way you're at least like also like playing the game more often and having that more consistent repetition of playing with the cards.
Yeah, that makes sense. I guess I wanted to put the number low because I don't want to like barrier people out if they can't play test. But I would say that like your first probably 3 to 4 hours a week should probably go into play testing. And then after that, I would say meaningful discussions is probably next, where at some point playtesting by yourself and just like internally trying to process things and learn from it is going to fall off compared to what you would gain from having discussions with other like-minded players. And once you've met basically the number of games you need to be at least like reasonably sharp, and then at that point you'll get more from the first few hours of discussion than you would from playing more games.
Okay, I'm on board. I want to see how you rank these last 2 now, though. These are what I'm most curious about because they're the most, I guess, dedication time-wise.
So it kind of depends how you want to or how focused your time is. I think that listening to podcasts is something you can do while you're doing something else, like you're mowing the lawn or doing dishes. You can turn a podcast on, and that kind of makes it more passive. Or when you're driving to work, I forgot some people still do that. I'm sorry.
Yeah, but do you think people can like really internalize and like learn? Or because I know sometimes I'll just put things on in the background just to have like noise, but like there are times where I can have a whole podcast go by and I'm like, you know what? I actually don't think I remember a word they said. It was just playing.
Jeez. I guess that kind of goes into why I was talking about trying to apply things from each episode, but it's hard to do that if you're like listening to a podcast on your way to work. You go work your full shift at work, you come back, you put on another podcast, and then you get home and you forgot everything from the first podcast.
Yeah.
I think that I would say that overall, I think you'll get more from replay review than you would from listening to podcasts once you reach a certain point that you're able to really notice your mistakes when you go back and watch replays. If you are watching replays and you feel like you aren't able to see mistakes, or you're trying to like calculate what's more efficient and you're having a lot of trouble with that, then I would say that consuming content is more important. But once you've consumed enough content, I think you'll start getting more and more from replay analysis. Basically, like as you get better, you get more returns from replay analysis, I think.
Oh, and you know what I just realized we didn't talk about consuming content? That's like actually a really good way to like learn and study the game. I used to do this all the time. with Magic is I would just go and play old Pro Tours. I would just load up like the Pro Tours for, or it was Worlds of like Shahar Shenhar versus Ben Stark on like, it's like an hour, it's like a 90-minute like Jeskai control mirror matchup. I just would watch that for fun sometimes. But go and just load up like all the VODs from the first Pro Tour or the second Pro Tour or whatever the most recent calling was. And you can watch what the good players are doing and like compare that to like what plays you're making in your own game to see if they're doing anything different with like even the exact same 80 cards.
Yeah, I would agree. And like specifically looking for matchups involving decks that you've been like practicing with is the most helpful when you've been practicing and you think you know like the play patterns for a deck and then you watch and they're doing something completely different or they play a hand very differently than you. That's like, that can be a very big level up moment.
Yeah, absolutely.
So that's a great point. I'm glad you brought that up because I did that a lot with Magic, and I don't just watch my own games of Flesh and Blood, I watch other people too.
I'll believe it when I walk in on you watching somebody else's VOD for once.
I've seen all of the Goliath Gauntlet that's out so far. Okay.
Mm-hmm. Yep. I saw Pablo Pintor lose as well. It was a great day. Some people say he's the best player in the world. He lost to Levia, Michael. You can't be the best player in the world and lose to Levia.
You're really trying to pick some fights. Pablo's great. Ethan's also very
he's good.
And
He's very good. He's just not Michael Hamilton, you know, but who is?
Okay, well, thanks for listening, everybody.
Unlike me, the next time you're playing Flesh and Blood, always remember, mind your manners. Thanks for listening, everybody.